Hi, I'm Lisa Ruble from Love to Color My World, and today I'm going to walk you through the steps to sew our Christmas sampler quilt that I designed for Sit and Sew Fabrics. This wall hanging has 4 different blocks: a wreath, a Christmas tree, a gift, and a stocking, which I'll show you how to put together today, and then we add sashing and a border and quilt it and bind it, and then you're done. So it's a project that you can finish up before the holidays if you want and be able to display it or give it as a gift. I also want to quickly point out to you 2 other projects that are kitted on the Sit and Sew website. This is the Gift Wrap Table Runner, and this is Tree Farm, which is a fusible applique project. And these are both also quick and easy holiday projects that you could get done before this year's festivities. So let's get started on working on our Christmas sampler quilt. So we're going to be starting out with the center of the wreath here and putting these quick corners on the white center. So start out with our white piece of fabric and the 4 squares, 2 green and 2 red. And the first thing I'm going to do is draw a diagonal line across the back of all 4 of those squares. So I'm going to start in one corner and position it so my diagonal line runs across there, and I'm going to stitch on that line, and then we'll trim the seam allowance and press the corner open. So I've got my square sewn on, and now I'm going to trim off the extra fabric, leaving a 1/4 inch seam allowance, and then take my iron and press that corner open. And there is one corner. I'm going to add the green to the opposite top corner, and then do the same thing, adding these red squares to the 2 bottom corners. So here's my wreath center unit. I'm going to set this aside for now, and we're going to make some half square triangles. We're going to do this with a red and white combo as well as a green and white combo. And so for both of those, I'm going to draw a diagonal line on the wrong side of my white squares. And if you are using a white on white fabric like I am, make sure that you are on the back of the fabric. And then I'm going to pair each one with the same size colored fabric, and then stitch a 1/4 inch from each side of that marked line. Now I'm going to cut on that original drawn line, and that will give me half square triangles. And for each of those, I'm going to press away from the light fabric so that my seam allowance ends up behind the dark fabric. So when I go to trim, I like to use a square ruler. I have a small 6.5 inch one here, and I'm going to line up so the diagonal line on the ruler is in line with my seam allowance, and then push it up towards the top and side edge as much as I can, trim off a little bit, and then when I flip it upside down, I can align the 2.5 inch lines on the trimmed edges and then get rid of the rest of whatever is left. And this will ensure that you end up with a nice square, half square triangle unit that is exactly the right size and with the diagonal seam running right from corner to corner. So our next step is to make the top of the wreath up here. And to do that, we're going to use 1 long green piece and 2 white squares. So just like we've done already, we're going to draw a diagonal line on the wrong side of our white squares. And then I'm going to position one at each end of this green piece with the lines pointed like this, and I'm going to stitch on both of those lines, and then we'll trim off the excess and press them open. So I've got my squares stitched on. Now I'm going to line up on that stitch line and trim the seam allowance to 1/4 inch. And then press those corners open. So there's our wreath top. I'm going to set this aside with our quilt center, and we'll keep on assembling parts of the wreath. So our next step is to sew the green half square triangles to opposite ends of our red piece. And they get positioned just like that. So I'm just going to stitch each of these on, and this is our wreath bottom unit. So here's our wreath bottom unit. I'm going to press both of these. I'm going to press toward the red, which will help us out a little bit later when we go to assemble the wreath. So there's the wreath bottom unit. I'm going to set that aside as well. And now we're going to move on to the bow unit. And the bow unit is made up of 5 squares, these 2 half square triangles, plus a white square on each side. So I'm going to sew all 5 of those together. So here's our bow unit. It's time to press this as well. I am going to press towards these outer white squares for these outside seams, and then toward the red fabric for these middle seams. So now we're going to assemble our wreath row by row. And at the top, we've got the top wreath unit, and then the center with these 2 green strips on the sides. And then the bottom wreath unit, and last but not least, that bow unit at the bottom. So here's our rows that will get sewn together. Then we've got 2 white strips to add on the sides, and our first block will be complete, just like that. So I've got my 4 rows of wreath pieces put together, and here's my wreath looking pretty good. Now our last step is to add a white strip to the opposite edges, and that will give us a 12.5 inch square block, and then we'll be done with the wreath block. So here's my finished wreath block, just like the one in our finished quilt. 1 block down, 3 to go, and then we can start putting our quilt together. Time to move on to the Christmas tree block. So now it's time to make the second block in the Christmas sampler, and that is our tree block right here. This block also goes together in rows like our wreath block did, and we alternate the 2 different greens to just add some interest to our tree. So you can see I've got the greens laid out here, and right now it looks more like a birthday cake than a tree, but what we're going to do is add white corners onto each of these pieces to make it look more like a pine tree. So I've got lines marked on the wrong side of all of these, and they get laid out like this with the diagonals pointing in toward the top. And we'll just work our way down each row. So we're going to start with this top row here, and this one ends up like a flying geese unit, so we have to do 1 at a time. So I'm going to lay my marked square on with my diagonal line going across and stitch on that line. And then I'm going to trim off the excess, so there's a 1/4 inch seam allowance, and press that corner open. Okay, and now I'm going to do the same thing on the other side. Line up my raw edges, have my diagonal line going across my marked square, and I'm going to stitch on that line. Now I'm going to line up the 1/4 inch line on that stitch line, cut off those corners, and press that white corner open. And this becomes the very top of our tree. So now we're going to move on to the next row down, And the next 4 rows will all be done like this one. Because there's a gap here, we're not making a flying geese. You can actually sew both white marked squares on at the same time. So I'm going to line them up like this, and I'll sew this one on and then that one on and come back and trim. Okay, so I'm going to trim off the excess from both of those squares that I stitched on. And then press both open. There we go. And I can start building my tree. So these next 3 rows will go together just like this one did. We just have longer and longer green pieces. I've got my 5 tree rows put together, and now we just need to add some little white strips to the outer edges of 4 of the rows to make them all the same length, and then we can assemble. So, and again, if you're using a white on white fabric like I am, make sure that you have it the correct side up. And then this last white row will go down at the bottom with the tree trunk. So I'm going to sew the white pieces to each tree row, and then once I have each row assembled, then I will sew all of the rows together to complete my tree block. So just a quick note when you are pressing each row after you add on the white, because none of our seams will line up with the different rows, you can press the seam out towards the white fabric away from your piece section, which will be much easier than trying to press it the opposite way. And so you can see I've got all 6 of my rows laid out here, and now I'm going to start joining them together to make my finished block. Here's my tree block, a twin to the one up in our finished quilt. And just like that, we've got 2 of the 4 blocks done for this project. I think this one is actually my favorite of the group. You can have so much fun with different greens in it, and I love how it looks with the 2 alternating ones. So, time to move on to the next block. Now it's time to move on to block 3, the present block, the gift block. And unlike with typical gifts, we're going to start out with the ribbon and get to the wrapping second. So first thing we're going to do is make half square triangles with red and white so that we can create our bow. And I'm going to draw a line, diagonal line on the wrong side of my white square and pair it together with my red square and sew with a 1/4 inch out from each side of that drawn line. So with my 2 lines stitched, now I'm going to go back and cut on that original marked line, and that will give me 2 half square triangle units, which I'm going to press open, and I'm going to press away from the white fabric so that the seams are hidden behind my darker red fabric. Next up, I'm going to trim these so they measure 3.5 inches square. So I'm going to line up the diagonal line on my ruler with my seam, and I'm going to just trim a little bit away from the top and side, and then rotate it 180 degrees, line up my 3.5 inch marks with those trimmed edges, and cut the remaining 2 sides. I'm going to do the same with this second one. So by working with slightly larger squares, it gives you some trimming room, which means that you can make your half square triangles more precise. So you can trim them to exactly what they need to be and make sure that diagonal line is centered from corner to corner. Okay? So now we're going to continue making our bow row actually. And I'm going to put these 2 white squares out top of here, and then I end up with my bow for my package. So I'm going to sew these together in pairs and then join them to make the entire bow unit. So now that I've got my bow unit done, it's time to lay out the gift unit. And these green rectangles almost look like squares because the measurements are very close. You want to make sure you have them oriented correctly, and you'll know that you do because they should be the same height as the red ribbon that goes down the center. And then we've got that red ribbon that crosses, and then our 2 other sections at the bottom. So I'm going to sew these green rectangles to the sides of the red ribbon and make 2 for my top and bottom parts of the gift. So I've got gift pieces sewn to each side of my ribbon, and now I'm going to press, and I'm going to press toward the red ribbon. In this particular case, it doesn't matter because you'll be sewing it to a single piece of fabric, so we don't need to worry about seams nesting, but I just think it's easier to sew, to press in. I'm going to do that for both of these. And then we'll sew these 2 units to the long edges of our longer ribbon piece. And then we'll add the bow on the top. So right now I'm going to sew these pieces to my red ribbon, and then I'm going to add in these white strips on the side, and that will make our block wide enough, and then we will add the bow unit on the top. So when it's time to add the second piece of your gift on to your long center ribbon, you want to make sure that these 2 ribbon pieces will match up really well. And what you can do to ensure that is flip it over like this and pull it back and just adjust it as you need to so that the ribbon on this piece and this piece align, and then pin those 2 spots in particular. And then your ribbon should line up, and then you can go and add pins out to the edges as well. So I've got my gift all assembled or wrapped, and it's time to add the ribbon to the top. So you can see by adding these white pieces to the edge, my present will now be the same width as my bow. So what I want to do, and what should work out if you've sewed correctly, but you can just double check, is you want to make sure that your bow is centered over this red ribbon piece here. So I'm going to flip it over and just make sure that that seam is centered on that middle ribbon piece, and then that will ensure that my bow is centered. And again, if you've sewed everything with a consistent seam allowance, that should line up with having your bow unit pieces match up along the outer edges with the gift. And then I'm going to sew down this line and my block will be complete. Here's my gift block. Matches up with the one in the quilt. And now we've got 3 of the 4 blocks done. The last one to work on is our stocking block. So our last block to sew for the Christmas sampler is the stocking block. And it's a couple rectangles, a square, and then some carefully placed quick corners to give our stocking some shape. So we're going to start out with those quick corners. I've drawn a diagonal line on the wrong side of 3 white squares. I'm going to put 1 back here for the heel, and then 2 up here for the toe. So for each of those, I'm going to stitch on the drawn line and then trim the seam allowance and press them open, and then we'll be halfway done with our stocking block already. So I've got my quick corners sewn on for the heel and the toe, and I'm going to lay these pieces down with the rest of my block center, and I'm going to sew the large red rectangle to the green and then the white rectangle to the red square. And then I'll join those two halves and we'll have our stocking. Then we'll just add some white around it to get it up to size and it'll be complete. So there's my stocking. And now the last thing to do is to add the white strips all the way around it. There's two shorter and narrower strips that will go top and bottom. And then the remaining strips will go on the sides to give us a 12.5-inch square unfinished block. My stocking block is complete, and now it's time to assemble our wall hanging. So grab your borders and sashing fabric. We're going to have two sashing pieces that divide up the blocks in each row, one long sashing piece down the center, and then the 4 border pieces, and that's it. Then our quilt top will be done. So it's time to put our blocks and sashing rows together. So what I'm going to do is lay out a sashing piece between my 2 top row blocks. And then I'm going to sew each of the blocks to the sashing, and I'm going to press the seams toward the red fabric because then it won't show through this white. So I've got a sashing piece stitched between each of my 2 sets of blocks. Now I'm going to add in this sashing piece, and I'm going to move this out of the way. What you want to do is cut your sashing pieces, and this works for borders too, cut your sashing piece to size, to the size that the pattern says, and then pin it at both ends and in the middle. And if your block and sashing row isn't quite the same as that, because our piecing can be a little imperfect sometimes, what you want to do is ease it to fit. So make it fit, and that will help you end up with a project that is more square as opposed to maybe getting a little diagonal. So you can see my pieced part is maybe a little bit shorter than this, but I've got it pinned and I kind of have the excess spread out. So as I sew, if I just kind of keep a hand on it, it will all end up fitting at the right size. So I've got my long sashing piece stitched to the first 2 blocks, and now I'm going to add this top section. And much like we did to make sure that the 2 pieces of ribbon aligned across that horizontal piece,